The fine rain seemed to follow Etta Rose like an old habit. Her denim jacket no longer kept out the cold, and the strap of her bag brushed against her shoulder insistently, as if trying to remind her that she was still there. The bar's sign flickered. In faded blue, Blue Note Live Music. The letters were chipped like her own courage. For a moment, she considered turning back, disappearing into the night as she had always done. But her feet kept walking, almost of their own accord. The porch floor creaked under her steps, a muffled sound that reverberated like a protest. She noticed her left heel wobble, twist slightly, but she didn't stop. The wet wood smelled of rain and memories, the kind she preferred to forget. When she pushed the door, she was greeted by the muted buzz of mixed conversations, loose laughter, and the trembling sound of a saxophone lost on the radio. No one turned to look. No one expected anything more from that door. And for now, that comforted her. The bar was a dive, but not just any dive. It was the kind of place where the furniture carried stories that no one else had the courage to tell. The scratched tables, the cracked leather booths, the tiny stage pressed against a sweaty wall of cigarettes and decades. To the left, a poster taped up read, "Open mic, step up and sing." That was it. No glamour. No guarantees. But for Etta, it was more than she had had in 20 years. She walked to the bar trying to appear smaller than she was. The bartender, a man in an unbuttoned shirt with the look of someone who had seen it all, raised his eyebrows. Not in greeting, but in doubt. "A glass of water, please," she said, trying to steady her voice. He didn't respond, just turned and poured. The ice clinked in the glass, a clean, almost cruel sound, as if everything in that bar had been designed to remind her that she was still out of tune. In a dimly lit corner, she saw the stage. Almost nothing. A crooked microphone, a tired speaker, and a spotlight that seemed to work when it wanted to. Next to it, a spiral notebook and a ballpoint pen, the sign-up sheet. All she had to do was write her name and wait her turn. She approached it as if she were approaching a grave, not out of fear of death, but out of respect for what had been buried long ago. She picked up the pen with fingers that would not obey, wrote, Etta R., and stepped back as if the paper might explode. As she moved away, she sat in the last booth of the row. The seat creaked like everything there. Across the room, men played. Pool with eyes that saw nothing beyond the cue and the glass. Women laughed too loudly at jokes that were too short. It was a place where no one remembered yesterday perfect for someone trying to erase 20 years. But Etta didn't want to forget. She wanted to sing. Only she no longer knew if the voice was hers, or merely an echo of what once was. Her eyes found a man sitting alone near the window. He wore sunglasses even inside. His beard was white, unkempt, and his hair was tied back in a tiny, disheveled bun. On the table, a glass of bourbon, and leaning against the wall, a dusty guitar. He didn't move much. Only his fingers, which tapped on the tabletop as if he still heard music when no one else heard anything. Etta felt something strange, as if that man was also waiting for something the world had forgotten. She pulled the glass of water closer and drank in short sips, trying to wash away the dryness of her throat and her life. Her voice seemed buried under layers of dust and silence. An imposed silence, cultivated, accepted out of fear, out of habit, out of love that had turned into a prison. Her husband wouldn't allow it. He said blues was the devil's music. That singing was a vanity of a lost woman. And though she never believed it, there came a moment when she stopped fighting. Silencing herself, after all, was easier than living in war at home. But he died. And when the coffin was lowered, Etta felt something deeper than grief, a strange kind of relief, followed by overwhelming guilt, as if it were wrong to breathe again, as if freedom were a sin. Still, she didn't cry at the funeral, not the next day, but at night, alone on the porch, she opened the box where she kept the lyrics she had never sung. That was where her truth lay, her songs, her scars with melody. And that night, she decided she needed to try, even if it were for the last time. Now, in that bar forgotten by God and critics, it was her chance to resurrect something she had buried herself. But she didn't know if it was too late. The other voices were young, full of energy and style. People who had never been silenced by a shut up, said through clenched teeth. People who had never had to apologize for existing. She had. And that's why her hands trembled. Not out of fear of the stage, but of what might happen if no one truly listened. Time passed slowly, marked only by names being called to the microphone. One by one, the hopefuls went up, sang, received lukewarm applause. Some were off-key, others exaggerated the high notes. But no one there sang with the weight of a torn soul. Etta knew that. And she knew that if she went up, she couldn't compete with technique. Only with truth. And truth in that moment was all she had. Silence doesn't always begin with a scream. Sometimes it begins with a cutting look in the middle of a sentence. That's how it was with Etta and Marvin. The first time he told her to stop singing, he used a smile. He said it was just a joke, that she was too beautiful to live by microphone. She laughed too, finding it funny. But inside, a crack opened and never closed again. Before Marvin, Etta sang on Sunday mornings while frying bacon and the radio crackled Ella Fitzgerald at low volume. She improvised verses with the pots, sang off-key with joy, and lived with a free voice. It was her way of being in the world. The house vibrated with her music. Silence had never been natural to her. But Marvin liked control. He liked a clean house, a low tone of voice, things in their place. Etta's joy seemed to mess everything up. Slowly, he pushed music into the corners, first the living room, then the kitchen, then the bedroom. Sing inward, he would say, for yourself. And Etta obeyed. He didn't shout. He shaped, like someone folding a piece of paper until it fit into a little box. Etta, who was made of wind and loose notes, began to fit in. She kept the lyrics in a notebook and started to sing only in the shower, and even then softly. The music became a secret, and the secret became a habit. The years passed like a scratched record. Etta worked in a laundromat in the city, went home, and prepared dinner. Marvin ate in silence. She tried to make conversation, sometimes humming without realizing he said nothing, but his silence was heavier than any shout. It was a silence that taught fear. There was one night when she signed up to sing at a church festival. She wrote her name down, practiced in secret, chose a blue dress that Marvin hated. When he found out, he didn't break anything. He just tore the paper with her name on it and said, "Don't embarrass me." And she never tried again. Gradually, she began to believe that she was already too old, that her voice was ordinary, that music was for those who had nothing to do. Marvin made it seem like she was selfish for wanting to sing, as if the stage was an affront to the family, as if her dream was an intimate sin against him. But there were nights when she woke up alone, not knowing why, and went to the living room. She sat on the couch with a notebook on her lap and wrote verses in silence. The lyrics trembled, but the soul screamed there. She didn't stop composing. She just stopped showing. Her voice didn't die, it was just buried. Etta saw the years passing on her own face, the wrinkles arriving, youth dissolving like stove smoke. She learned to look at herself in the mirror without seeing. Her image became a wall, useful, functional, immobile. But deep down, there was still a woman who dreamed of stages. When Marvin got sick, she took care of him with tenderness, changed sheets, fed him, prayed in silence, not out of love, out of duty, because that was what was expected of a wife. She knew he would never have done the same, but that mattered little. She was used to giving without receiving. The week he died, the kitchen radio broke. Such an obvious symbol that Etta laughed to herself. It was as if the world said, "Now it's just you." The funeral was simple. It rained. She stood still, as if mourning were another kind of prison. But inside, something began to creak. For the first time in decades, she slept with the bedroom door open. The sound of the rain was music. She missed the noise, the crackle of vinyl, the breath between verses. She slept dreaming of chords, woke up scared. Freedom is a space that hurts in the first days. It was the following Sunday that she opened the hidden box. There were the notebooks, more than 20. Lyrics, poems, notes about shows that never happened. She cried silently, then laughed out loud. It was like finding herself alive inside a poorly closed tomb. She began to sing slowly. Alone at Dawn. The first song came out broken, out of tune. But it had pain and truth. The rusty voice seemed to seek its own path. It began to free itself little by little, like muscles that were in a coma. This wasn't rehearsal. It was survival. On Monday, she bought a new radio, turned it up loud while cleaning the house, sang along with the old divas, Aretha, Billy, Mahalia, repeated snippets like mantras. I'm gonna lay down my burden. If someone looked from the outside, it seemed crazy, but it was just rebirth. The neighbors began to notice. You seem lighter, Etta. You're smiling again. What song was that last night? She made excuses, said it was just a cleansing of the soul. But inside, her heart was already beating to the rhythm of a new time. It was on a Tuesday that she saw the poster in the grocery store window. Open night, anyone can sing Blue Note Bar, Wednesday at p.m. She read and reread it as if trying to translate an ancient language. She felt her hand tingle. Thought of Marvin, and thought, now it's not about him anymore. During the week, she practiced in secret, sitting in the kitchen with a makeshift microphone made from a wooden spoon. Her hands were sweaty. She missed the notes, cried in the chorus. But she didn't stop, because now it wasn't about perfection. It was about not being silent anymore. She even tore the registration paper, then taped it back together. She even promised she wouldn't go, then lied to herself saying she would only watch. Deep down, she knew she would sing, that she needed to, that she was in debt to that woman who had been silenced for so long. On Wednesday, it took her hours to choose her outfit. Nothing matched her courage. She ended up wearing something simple, with a scarf that belonged to her mother, a woman, who also never had a voice, but taught her to love music. Ancestry pushed her forward. She left before the sunset, walked slowly. Each step seemed to weigh a decade. She thought about turning back, thought about disappearing, thought about everything. She hadn't lived, but she kept walking, because now there was a stage. And if she didn't sing for herself, no one would do it. She carried the old notebook in her bag, open to the page of a song she wrote after Marvin first called her out of tune. The lyrics said, "Maybe I sing off key, but my heart doesn't lie." It was enough. When she reached the bar's door, she saw the sign blinking. A blue reflection danced on her skin as if saying, "Now is your time." She took a deep breath, touched the doorknob with trembling fingers, and thought, "If I don't sing today, this voice dies with me." So she entered. Time seemed frozen in the bar. Each performance dragged on like an unregulated clock, marking seconds that weighed like minutes. Etta looked at the notebook in front of her, her fingers gripping the edges of the pages. Her name was already there, written in a firm hand for a heart so hesitant. The microphone on stage waited like a silent judge. Etta didn't know if it was the cold or the fear that made her spine chill. The host called the next name. A young guy, cap turned backward, strong voice, unleashed a blues full of flourishes. The audience responded with warm applause. That was nothing new. They were people full of technique, but with few scars. Etta wasn't there to impress anyone. She just wanted to bleed out loud, like someone opening their soul and saying, "I'm here." Even if no one listened, even if they laughed. Her name was called next. Etta rose. "Are you there?" The voice came muffled from the microphone, scratched by the tired speaker. A strange silence spread through the room. One of those silences that are no noise at all, but say everything. She hesitated. She almost stood up and walked away. Almost let the story stop there once again. But her legs decided for her. And when she realized it, she was already standing. The path to the stage was short for her body, but long in her mind. Each step sounded like a judgment. Each gaze felt like a sentence. There were those who whispered, those who frowned, those who looked at their phones. Most didn't even raise their eyes. It was as if they were saying, "What is that old woman doing here?" But she didn't back down. She climbed the 3 steps as if ascending a mountain, and at the top, faced the microphone. Her hand trembled. The paper with the lyrics was crumpled in her pocket, but she knew the song by heart. So many nights singing to herself had etched those words into her very being. The dim light from the spotlight warmed her face. She closed her eyes because looking back still hurt. She took a deep breath and released the first note. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't in tune, but it was hers. From within, from a place that had never been touched. The voice came out shaky, caught in her throat like a bird long caged. But the melody was sincere. Each word tasted like contained. Tears like a dish washed in silence, like an honest kiss. The bar slowed down. The sounds of billiards ceased. The waiter paused with the tray midway. Etta didn't notice. She sang as if she were alone, as if she were finally at home. The lyrics spoke of a forgotten woman, of a flower that no longer blooms during the day, but still blossoms in the dark. It spoke of fear and hope mixed like smoke and a lit candle. It spoke of her, the chorus, hurt like a poked scar, but still she sang, because that was her prayer, her exorcism, her liberation. And then he moved. At the corner table, the man in the sunglasses lifted his head. The fingers that had been tapping distractedly now pressed the tabletop rhythmically. There was a slight sway in his body, like someone recognizing a lost sound. He couldn't see, but he heard better than anyone. And at that moment, Elijah Boone listened to Etta's soul. The whole bar felt small. Everyone watched without blinking, but she didn't notice. The music swallowed everything. It wasn't the voice of a star. It was the voice of a wounded woman, but alive. That kind of singing that doesn't rise to the clouds, it crawls on the earth like roots. In the last verse, her voice faltered. A sob almost broke free. She swallowed, breathed, and sang the last line, like someone closing a wound with a dull needle. When the music ended, there was a second of absolute silence. Then, a timid applause. 1 second. Another. Suddenly, the whole bar burst into applause. But what caught Etta's attention wasn't that. It was the metallic sound of a chair scraping in the corner. Elijah Boone was getting up. The guitar, leaning against the wall for years, was pulled out carefully. He walked to the stage with slow steps. People knew him, some murmured his name. Elijah Boone was a forgotten legend, a guitarist who had played with sacred monsters of the blues, who vanished after his wife's death. No one had seen him play in at least 10 years. But that night, he took the guitar off his shoulder, because Etta's voice had called him back. She stood still, not understanding. Elijah didn't ask for permission, didn't say a word. He simply sat next to her, tuned the instrument with almost mystical touches, and strummed the first chord. A pure ancestral sound came from the strings, a lament that danced with her voice as if they had known each other for lifetimes. Etta closed her eyes and understood. That was soul music, music that bleeds. They played together, improvising. A second verse was born there, in the improvisation of fingers and shared pain. She sang, he responded. It was a conversation between two wounds. The audience stopped being an audience. They became witnesses. It was something that no one could explain. Those notes said what no words could reach. It was love in the form of rebuilt ruin. In the end, Etta whispered the last verse. Elijah just slid the final chord, like someone rocking someone to sleep. Silence. A full silence. Full of things said, of things healed. They looked at each other, though he couldn't see. He seemed to see more than anyone. She smiled. And he returned with what he could, a slight nod. The audience exploded in applause. But neither of them heard. They were in a place where the sound was more intimate. When they got off the stage, she walked to the bar as if stepping on holy ground. The waiter served her a bourbon on the house. You saved the night, he said. She smiled, shyly. But inside, she knew it wasn't the night that had been saved. It was her. Elijah approached, touched her shoulder gently. You made me play again, he murmured. I don't even remember how I got here. Etta didn't respond. Sometimes silence is also music. She just placed her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but it said everything. As the bar came back to life, as others resumed laughing and drinking, the two sat in the corner. They didn't talk much. They just stayed, sharing a silence. That didn't hurt. A silence that embraced. It was as if time had stopped just for them. And for the first time in decades, she didn't feel alone. The world outside was still the same. Difficult, noisy, unfair. But inside that bar, on that stage, in that music, something had changed. She was no longer a broken woman. She was a whole woman. With scars, yes, but whole. The music didn't save her. She saved herself by singing. The next day dawned with a shy sun filtered through gray clouds. Etta woke up with a dry throat and a strangely light soul. It was as if part of the weight she had carried in her chest had been left on the stage the night before. Still in her. Nightgown, She walked to the kitchen and turned on the radio. For the first time in a long time, she danced alone while the coffee brewed. She didn't dance beautifully. She danced as if she were still alive. Elijah Boone also woke up differently. In the silent house, where only memories had once lived, there was now a guitar out of its case, leaning against the armchair. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it represented an entire world starting to spin again. He ran his fingers over the strings without actually playing, as if he were waiting for the music to call him once more. At the Blue Note, the waiters were still talking about the performance. "That was out of this world," one said. "I never saw Boone get up from that corner." "She has something," said another, unable to explain what. The tables where the two had played together became instant legends. But Etta didn't return to hear compliments. She wasn't looking for that. What she wanted was to understand what had happened inside her. On Thursday, Etta returned to the bar before opening time. She carried a package of cornbread and homemade butter in her hands. Elijah was already there, sitting with the guitar in his lap as if he hadn't left since the night before. She approached silently, and he smiled before he even heard her speak. "You sing like someone who has cried very quietly," he said. She replied simply, "And you play like someone who listens even to what we don't say." Their friendship began in that rhythm, quietly, without haste. Every afternoon, Etta showed up at the bar. Elijah was always in the same corner. They played together, improvised, laughed. The bar allowed it. It became an open rehearsal. Some customers came just to see them. Others didn't even know who they were, but fell silent upon hearing the music. There was something about that partnership that silenced the world. Etta began to dress differently. Colorful scarves, light dresses, dark lipstick on her lips. Not to seduce, to celebrate. She was looking at herself in the mirror again, and little by little, recognizing the woman who lived there. She was no longer Marvin Shadow. She was no longer just the widow. She was Etta Rose blues singer, owner of her own voice. Elijah, for his part, cleaned the porch of his house. He took the pictures of his ex-wife off the wall and put them in a box, along with old letters and sheet music he never wanted to read again. It wasn't forgetting. It was respect. That pain had already been touched enough. Now there was another note beginning, a new melody, softer, more mature, but alive. One night, after yet another duet at the Blue Note, Etta stayed late. The bar closed, the staff left, and the two remained there in a silence that didn't need to be filled. Elijah poured 2 bourbons and asked, "Have you ever thought about recording?" She laughed. "Record what?" "The pains I sing are only for those who have lived the same." He replied firmly, "Then that's why they need to be recorded." The idea of entering a studio seemed absurd, but also real. Etta no longer dreamed of big stages, but she wanted to leave something documented, like a testament of someone who survived the silence. They began to compose together. Elijah created the harmonies. Etta brought the verses. It was like stitching, memories with sound, and each song seemed to heal an old wound. The rehearsal sessions began to take on another form. They weren't just music. They were exchanges. She told stories of when she was a girl. He talked about the road, the long nights, and the stages that wouldn't let him sleep. She spoke of her husband in a low voice. He spoke of his wife with a trembling voice. Their pains understood each other. One day, Etta asked, "Do you still miss her?" Elijah replied with teary eyes, "I do. But it's different. Before, the pain was a weight. Now, after you, it has turned into longing. Longing is lighter. She said nothing. She just held his hand. For the first time, the news that the two would do a small show together spread throughout the city. It would be on a special night to raise funds to restore the old church. The Blue Note would provide the space. The list of names was small, but everyone was waiting for Etta and Elijah. For the first time, she chose to sing not a past pain, but a possible love. In rehearsal, Elijah brought a new song. There were no lyrics, just chords. He said he needed her voice to complete it. Etta listened to the melody with her eyes closed. When she opened them, she already knew the first verses. It was a song about starting over after shame, about finding shelter in the midst of the storm, about finally being seen. The night before the show, Etta woke up before the sun rose. She sat on the porch with a coffee in hand and thought about her whole life. She thought of the times she stayed silent out of fear, of the nights she screamed inside her mind, of the silences she pretended to accept. Now all of that had turned into lyrics, and that was a miracle. Elijah spent the whole day cleaning the guitar, as if he were preparing for something sacred. For the first time in a long time, he wore the old white shirt he used to wear on the road. He didn't want to look young. He wanted to look whole, because now he was. At the appointed time, the Blue Note was packed. The lights were brighter, the people quieter. When Etta stepped on stage, there was no more trembling, just presence. Next to her, Elijah waited with a calm smile. They looked at each other and began. The first song was slow, deep. Her voice filled the space between the strings of the guitar. Each note seemed to come from a time that no longer exists. The people in the audience cried without knowing why, because they recognized in that music some pain that was also theirs. At the end of the performance, there were no screams. There was silence, the kind that lingers after a prayer ends. And someone in the back whispered, "They healed us." Etta heard and smiled, because she knew that, yes, there was healing there. But the first to be healed had been herself. On the way out, a woman approached. She touched Etta's arm and said, "Thank you. You sang my story." Etta replied, "I sang ours." And for the first time, she realized that singing wasn't about herself. It was about transforming collective pain into shared hope. That night, Elijah took her home. They sat in the car for a while without haste. He didn't say he loved her. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her said it all. Etta touched his face and said, "Thank you for listening to me." He held her hand and replied, "You brought me back." Before leaving, he took a handkerchief from his pocket. It belonged to his deceased wife. She used it at shows, he said. But today, it's yours. Etta received it as one receives a relic, with respect, with love, with presence. When she entered the house, she hung the handkerchief on the hallway mirror. And for the first time, she felt that home wasn't made of walls. It was made of music, and she had found a new home in her own voice. The morning after the show, Etta woke up to a sound she hadn't heard in a long time, the landline ringing. It was unusual. Almost no one called anymore. She answered with a voice still hoarse from emotion. On the other end, silence. Then a heavy breath. And then the voice. A voice she would never forget, scratchy, dry, and full of unwanted memories. "Etta, it's Dwayne. Marvin, brother." And the ground seemed to disappear for a moment. Dwayne spoke as if he saw no problem in inflicting pain. He said he heard around town that she had been showing up, putting herself out there, singing like she was 20. He used words like shame, respect for my brother's memory, decency. Etta listened in silence, not because she agreed, but because that tone still knew where it hurt. When he hung up, she stood still, staring into the void, her fingers still gripping the phone. She thought she was healed, that the stage, the music, Elijah's affection had been enough to bury it all. But there, in that moment, she realized that the voices of the past do not disappear. They just whisper more quietly, and sometimes they come back to scream. She walked through the house as if relearning how to walk. She sat at the table, tried to write, but the pen felt heavy, and for the first time in weeks, she felt fear again. Elijah noticed immediately when he saw her that afternoon. The light in her eyes was different, less firm, more withdrawn. He asked if she was okay. Etta replied with a yes that sounded like a "don't ask me," but he knew how to listen beyond words. He played a new song with a dragged melody. She didn't react, didn't hum, just listened quietly, as if hearing her own mourning. That night, Etta didn't sleep. She had nightmares again. Marvin sitting in the bar's audience, looking at her with disapproval. Dwayne getting on stage and yanking the microphone from her hand. The audience laughing. Her trying to sing, but without a voice. She woke up breathless, sweaty, with a wet pillow. And there, in the dark, she thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm going too far. The next day, she didn't show up at the bar. Not the next day. Not over the weekend. Elijah began leaving notes on her door. Short, simple phrases. Your absence makes noise. I have a chord waiting for your voice. When you're ready, I'll be here. But Etta didn't respond. She was immersed in an ancient silence, a silence she knew well. She spent her days looking out the window, avoided the radio, avoided singing, avoided herself. The memories came back like a raging tide, Marvin erasing her lyrics, the disapproving looks from the neighbors, the whispers when she went out alone. It was as if everything she had rebuilt was in ruins again, as if the stage had been just a dream, and she was now back in the old nightmare. It was only on Tuesday afternoon, when she opened the box with her music notebooks, that something broke. Among the pages, she found an old lyric, scrawled years ago when she was still married. Even if no one hears, I am a living note. She read it as if another woman had written it. A woman who, even trapped, still believed in her own song. And she cried like she hadn't since the funeral. That same night, she dressed up and walked to the Blue Note. Not to sing, just to watch. She needed to remember the smell of the wood, the sound of ice in glasses, the creaking of chairs. Elijah was there, as always, playing alone. When he saw her enter, he didn't smile, but he stopped playing and just looked at her, calmly, as if to say, take all the time you need. She sat at the farthest table, ordered coffee, not bourbon. She wanted clarity. She watched the night's musicians, all good, all in tune, but felt something missing. It was her, the space of her pain, her truth. And she realized that without her song, the world became shallow again. She left the bar before Elijah finished, but left a note with the waiter. Tomorrow, I'll be back, and I'll bring my voice. The next morning, she put on lipstick, wore the scarf Elijah had given her, not as a symbol of love, but as a flag of resistance. She arrived early at the bar. Elijah was already waiting for her with 2 coffees and a new melody. Without saying a word, she took the notebook from her bag, wrote the first line of a new song. The past knocked on the door, but who answers now is me. They rehearsed all day. The song was slow, melancholic, but with a chorus that rose like a prayer. It was about not apologizing anymore, about singing even with fear, about living even after having died in life. Etta sang as if she were stitching each piece of herself that had been torn. Elijah, with his guitar, sealed each scar with sound. The show was scheduled for Friday. It would be a Ray presentation at the Blue Note, but everyone knew it was more. It was the return of someone who had disappeared. The city murmured. Some cheered. Others judged. Dwayne, upon hearing, showed up at the bar's door the night before. He waited for Etta to come out. She saw him. He approached, said that the family didn't approve. Etta just looked and said, "The music approved me." On Friday, the bar was full, the air heavy with expectation. Elijah played 2 songs. Alone first, preparing the ground. When Etta stepped on stage, silence was immediate. It wasn't the same silence as the first time. It was a silence of reverence, of those who recognize they are about to see someone become whole before their eyes. She didn't say anything, just looked at Elijah, who strummed the first chord. Etta closed her eyes and began. The voice was firm. Not clean, there was still pain, but firm. Each verse was a punch and a hug. Each note said, "I'm back." And no one in the bar doubted it. In the middle of the song, she looked to the back of the hall and saw Dwayne. He was there, arms crossed, face hard. But she didn't look away. She sang looking straight at him, as if to say, "I am this woman, and nothing in you can silence me again." And when she finished the chorus, he looked down, defeated not by her, but by the truth. The audience applauded standing. Elijah approached and extended his hand to her. She stepped off the stage with her head held high. She wasn't seeking approval. She was seeking freedom. And there, in the sound of applause, she found what she needed, her own permission to exist. Wholly. After the show, the 2 walked down the empty street in silence. The sky was clear, the moon huge. Etta said, "I thought I had lost everything again." Elijah replied, "You can't lose what you are." And she smiled, because she knew he was right. Her voice wasn't a gift. It was a choice. They reached the porch of her house. Elijah hesitated for a moment. Etta held his hand and said, "Stay for a while." He stepped inside. They sat side by side on the couch. They didn't kiss. They didn't promise each other anything. They just stayed, with the new silence, the one that welcomes, that cradles, that sings along. On the shelf, the notebook with the new song lay open. Etta looked at him and said, "I still have more to say." Elijah replied, "And I still have strings I haven't played." She rested her head on his shoulder, closed her eyes, and there, in the dark, she heard her own breath like a sustained note at the end of a song, one that hasn't ended yet. The city remained the same, slow, dusty, divided between those who pray too much and those who drink too much. But Etta walked differently through the streets. Her step was firm. The scarf around her neck fluttered like a personal flag. She no longer averted her gaze. The whispers came, still came, but they no longer pierced her skin. She had become a woman of the stage, and there was no greater stage than living with her head held high. Her routine adjusted like a new song. Rehearsals on Thursday mornings, performances on Fridays, compositions on Sundays. Elijah was always nearby, but he never intruded. He wasn't a dominating man. He was a man who walked alongside. Etta, who had always feared loving again, began to understand. It's not love that hurts, it's loving without being seen. And for the first time, she was. In the week of the city's music festival, the Blue Note was invited to send a representative. Elijah declined. He said he had already had his days on the road. But Etta, with a notebook of lyrics in hand, said, "Then it will be for me." He smiled as if he knew this moment would come. And for the second time in her life, she signed up to sing for an unknown audience. Only now, she herself was no longer the same. The festival was at the old municipal theater. Bright lights, a large audience, judges sitting in rows with clipboards in hand. When Etta stepped onto the stage, she saw all of this. But she didn't tremble. She just took a deep breath and remembered Elijah's words, "You don't sing to impress. You sing to survive." And then she began. The song was new, but the pain was old, and the courage fresh. Each verse was a line written with the blood of all the silences she had endured. It spoke of love that was never asked for, of old age tasting like a new beginning, of dignity as a revolutionary act. When she finished, there was no explosion of applause. There was silence, the same silence of the first night. But now, she knew how to read it. It was the silence of a touched soul, of the truth that no one had the courage to say aloud. She won the award of the night. But what moved her the most was a letter she received after the performance. A 19-year-old girl wrote, "I thought my story was only mine, but you sang it all." Etta folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She no longer needed medals, but she needed this, the certainty that her pain had become a bridge. The following weeks passed gently. Fall arrived, painting the leaves a warm orange. One afternoon, Elijah showed up with an idea to record an album together. Homemade, simple, just voice and guitar. Not to sell, he said, to leave in the world. Etta agreed, like someone planting a tree, without haste, but with faith of deep roots. They recorded in a friend's improvised studio. An old microphone, a window letting the wind in, and a recorder that crackled. But none of that mattered. It was real. Each track began with a laugh or a sigh. They didn't cut those sounds. They are part of the music, Etta said. The album was ready in 2 months. The chosen name? Too old, like a gloved slap in the face of the world. They held a small listening session at the Blue Note. People from the city came. Old acquaintances. New faces. The album played on the device while the two sat hand in hand in the back. When the last track played, everyone fell silent. It wasn't a silence of an ending. It was a silence of fullness, like someone who just heard. Something that will echo for a long time. That night, on the porch of Etta's house, Elijah brought something from his pocket. A wine-colored velvet ribbon. Faded. It belonged to my wife. She gave it to me at the last show I did with her. I kept it for years. I thought I would never give it to anyone. Etta took the ribbon carefully. "You are not replacing anyone, Etta," he said. "I know, but I am whole now. I can accept what comes." In the following months, the album spread through the city, then through the internet, then through the local radio. It didn't become a phenomenon, but it touched places where the wounds were similar. Etta began to receive letters, notes, simple gifts. "You gave me a voice," many said. But the only thing she wanted She finally had peace in her own skin. One day, Dwayne showed up at her door. He had his head down, his gaze dull. "I listened to the album," he said, "and I cried." Etta let him in, not with resentment, but with respect for herself. He apologized. She accepted and said, "You have no idea what your words did, but I also didn't know what my voice was capable of healing." He left in silence, another kind of silence. At night, Etta and Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the album again. "I never thought I would experience this," she said. "Not just the music, the love, the place of listening, of choice." Elijah looked at her with tenderness. "I didn't either, but we survived. And that is more than luck. It's a miracle stitched with pain." Their love never turned into marriage, nor did it need to. It was love of eyes meeting, of hands finding each other without asking. They sometimes slept together, sometimes not. Mature love has its own rhythm. And Etta, after a lifetime of adapting to others' pace, learned to dance to her own beat. One Sunday, Etta sang in a church. The same church where, decades ago, Marvin had forbidden her to sing. The pastor asked. Etta stepped up to the pulpit, sang Amazing Grace with a voice full of the world. There were elderly people with tears, young people with wide eyes, and the echo of something breaking in the air, the last chain. In the last verses, she saw a reflection of herself, the woman from 20 years ago, shy, quiet, full of dreams, watching from afar. She smiled at her, as if to say, "It took a while, but you made it." As she left the church, a local reporter approached her. She wanted to do a story. "Do you have a phrase that sums up this journey?" she asked. Etta thought for a moment. Then she replied, "Only those who have bled in silence for too long truly sing." The reporter took note. Etta kept walking. In the years that followed, Etta and Elijah continued composing, recording, and singing, not for fame, but out of necessity. The pain from before did not disappear, but it was rewritten. And where there was trauma, now there was sheet music. Where there was shadow, now there was a stage. When Etta departed old and fulfilled, the entire city attended her funeral. There were flowers, musicians, and a cassette tape playing. Her album on a loop. Elijah, no longer playing, sat beside the casket and held the burgundy velvet ribbon. She sang until the end, he told everyone. And the silence that followed was the most beautiful of all. But this is not a story about death. It is a story about voice, about what happens when someone finds their own note, their own lyrics, their own rhythm, about what blooms after the longest winter, and about how an old guitarist and a quiet woman composed together the rarest of songs, true love.